the key concept is stewardship. That is our responsibility. It's not ownership of creation, and it's not worship of creation. It is stewardship of creation. And we need to remember, too, a biblical worldview affirms, to Paul's point, that creation is not eternal, at least not in its present form. Go to Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews 1, verse 10. Where the writer says, "And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they all will become old like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end." So, at least in its present form, creation is not eternal. And it's all as a direct result of our sin. As a result of our sin, creation was cursed and subject to decay, and so we see that all around us. But creation is eventually going to be set free from that corruption of sin. Let me just read Romans 8:21 quick. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this verse, where it says that creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. If you go to 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is very clear. 2 Peter 3, verse 10. Where Peter writes, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning, and the elements will melt with intense heat." He says that twice. I think he's trying to get some emphasis going here. "But according to his promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." So this biblical worldview of creation is all-encompassing. It describes the past origins and development of the universe. In the beginning, God. It lays out the requirements for our involvement in this created world. We have that creation mandate. And it foretells the ultimate end, when all things will be undone and then renewed into a world where righteousness dwells, as Peter says. So that is kind of the biblical worldview. Now, let me ask you the question. Do you remember our tests? How do we test a worldview? You remember what those were? First one being the test of reason. Does it make sense? Can it survive in the marketplace of ideas, as Janet Parshall likes to use that term? Does it logically work? The test of reason. Then we have the test of the outer world. Is there some kind of corroborating evidence that would help me to agree or disagree that this worldview is true? And then there's the test of the inner world. Is there something within me? Is it a worldview that carries me through those ups and downs of life and is effective at doing that? And then there's the test of the real world, which is, how does it play out when it's actually applied? How does Marxism play out when it's actually applied? We wind up with a 20-hour work week making $1,250 a week. Maybe. We'll talk more about that. So how does it work? So let's look at this. Let's look at the biblical worldview through these 4 tests. First off, the test of reason. Is it unreasonable? Go ahead.
It seems to be important in distinguishing the Christian worldview from the New Age worldview. The Christian worldview, humans are the most important thing on this earth. Their values are what we should all be striving for, what the purpose of the planet is to support us. But the New Ager thinks the purpose of the existence, the earth is more important than humans. Humans are pollution.
So as we go forward, as we look at the other worldviews as we go along, you're going to see that there's a fundamental difference in where do these worldviews place humanity. That's where it really comes down to. So hold those thoughts. Now let me ask you a question. Is it unreasonable to believe in God because evil exists? What do you think? Is it unreasonable? Let's look at the test of reason here. Is it unreasonable to believe in God because evil exists? In other words, should I not believe in God because evil happens? Why not? Why is that not unreasonable? Is that a double negative? I don't know. Why is it reasonable to believe in God even if evil does exist? Good versus evil? Some people would say if there's an all-good, all-powerful God, he would be unwilling to coexist with evil. Why doesn't he do something about it if he's all-powerful? And if he's all-good, why does he allow it to exist? But to DJ's point, the very fact that we recognize something as being something that ought not to be, okay, by the very fact that we recognize that something ought not to be, it suggests to us that we know in our heart of hearts what ought to be. Does that make sense? In other words, the existence of evil, it's only evil because we know what good is, or we know what good should be. Kind of make sense? So is it unreasonable to believe in God because his existence cannot be proven? Can we prove that he exists? Okay. Maybe proof isn't the right word to use to describe evidence for the existence of God. Proof is in the realm of science, right? Okay? And in the realm of science, the whole issue of proof is limited to physical things. Things I can see, feel, hear, touch, experiment on, things like that. But is God physical? God the Father? No, he's spiritual. God is spiritual. He's beyond the material world. So from a scientific proof angle, which is looking at the physical world, we can't necessarily prove that he exists. He is beyond creation, as we've talked about, and he's not bound by creation either. But even though we can't prove it, we do have evidence of God's existence within the physical realm. And that evidence is what makes belief in God a reasonable belief. We'll talk about some of these. Let's talk first of all about the test of the outer world. When you look at general revelation, in other words, creation that's all around us, there are some things out there that provide evidence of the existence of God. Now we're going to go really a deep dive here, okay? So hold on to your hats. The laws of thermodynamics. Anybody familiar with those? So the first law of thermodynamics, and these are well-proven laws, states that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. So the total amount of energy that's in all of creation remains the same. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed. It can be transferred from one object to another. Visualize a pool ball. You hit the cue ball, the energy of that cue ball going forward hits another ball. It transfers the energy of the cue ball's movement to the new ball, to the 8 ball. Or it can be transformed. You turn on a light switch, that electrical energy goes into the light bulb, and it's transformed into radiant energy or light. The energy's still there, it's just either it's transferred or it's transformed, depending on what's going on. So the total amount of energy in cosmos, in the universe, is fixed. It can be neither created nor destroyed. But the second law of thermodynamics, that was the first law, Second law of thermodynamics states that the amount of energy in the universe that's available for useful work has always been decreasing. So, what that typically means is when that energy transfer takes place between the cue ball and the 8-ball, there's energy that takes place, energy transfer that takes place, but it's not 100% efficient. Some of that energy is lost, usually in the form of heat. Are we good so far? Okay. So as we go back in time, there would be a point. Remember now that the amount of energy in the cosmos is steady. It can be neither created nor destroyed. But the amount of energy available for work is always decreasing. So in theory, based on my little chart here, you can see that the blue, that's the total energy in the universe. It's changed in form or transferred, whatever. It's neither destroyed nor created. But the total energy available for useful work is constantly going down. Well, what does that mean? That would require a starting point where the two are equal, where the total amount of energy and the amount of energy available for work were equal. If there was no starting point, the amount of energy available for work would at some time in the past been greater than the total amount of energy in the universe, which is impossible. Are we good so far? So that is an indication that there is a starting point where the two were equal. And since that starting point, the amount of energy, based on the second law of thermodynamics, the amount of energy that's available for work has been decreasing. And that heat, that energy that's given up as part of that process, it disorders things. It creates what's called entropy. Entropy is disorder in the universe. You want to see an example of disorder? This is entropy in action. So, the strongest argument for the second law of thermodynamics, being truthful, and the strongest argument against evolution, in my mind, is my house. If I don't constantly impart energy into my house, eventually this is what it would look like, because it would fall apart. It's not evolving into a 14-bedroom mansion. Okay? It's wanting to fall apart all the time. That's the argument for the second law of thermodynamics, this entropy, and it's the argument against evolution. So, at some point, based on this, everything had a start. The universe had a beginning. Everything that has a beginning must have a cause. And what is that cause? God. God is considered to be the uncaused cause, because everything has a cause, except God. It's what's called the cosmological argument. Those laws of thermodynamics. Another aspect to that, another form of this argument, is God is the only thing, the only existence that absolutely must exist. Everything else is contingent. In other words, everything else that exists is not really necessary. They do not have to exist, but there has to be a cause for those things. Everything is dependent on a cause. You go back far enough there, it has to be a point somewhere where we reach the uncaused cause, which is God, because everything else is contingent on his existence. He is the only thing that's really necessary. And that first cause is God. So it is reasonable that the universe itself does not have to exist in and of itself. But it is reasonable to believe that it came into existence through an uncaused cause. And that uncaused cause is God. Now, there's a lot of people out there who believe in what's called spontaneous generation of life. That's the alternative to this special creation, that life somehow spontaneously generated through chance circumstances and then managed to survive through all of that, mutations, natural selection, all those things that Darwin was trying to explain through his book, The Origin of Species, and that living organisms organized themselves over time and became more complex as time went along. And that's what results in the variety of things that we see today, including all the diversity among human beings as well. But there are no modern experiments that have proven the existence of spontaneous generation. We can't bring forth life from non-life. So some have run with the idea of what's called panspermia, meaning there was life somewhere in outer space that has arrived here. Life exists in space, and it was deposited here by a comet or something like that. But the question is, where did that life come from? So that whole idea of panspermia doesn't work very well either. So is a worldview like panspermia or spontaneous generation, is that a reasonable worldview? No. But a worldview that has an uncaused cause is very reasonable. Another is what's called the teleological argument. It's the argument from design. All around us, it is very apparent that there is design within creation. And the evidence shows that this is conscious design, designed by an intelligent designer. And that includes the whole issue of information. You know, you see the DNA helix up there. The amount of information contained in the DNA in our bodies is phenomenal. I don't have any numbers for you, but how does information evolve? It doesn't. Information is information. And so information is part of this design. So that information that's found in our DNA is evidence of a design. Now you hear about, you might have heard about irreducible complexity. How can things evolve if all the parts aren't there to begin with? Now, I got a little example of a mousetrap up there. The mousetrap has what, 4 or 5 parts to it? If one of those parts is missing, does the mousetrap work? No. And the same is true with irreducible complexity. There are aspects of our bodies, for example, that are so complex that if one element of it is missing, it won't function. And so all of the elements have to be in place in order for that organ to function. I don't think evolution could do that. Because during the time while we're waiting for component X of my liver to develop, my liver isn't functioning properly, and I'm not surviving. Paul?
Yeah, evolution on the surface looks like a good explanation around how a life has changed over time. If you look closely, look at the details, like for instance, physiology and microbiology, for example, what the chemical process involved in our body create clotting of
Right.
blood, or whether it's an injury to you. It's an amazingly complex series of chemical reactions that have to occur in a certain order. That can't happen.
No, because clotting needs to happen. If clotting happens at the wrong time, it can lead to death. In the wrong time in the wrong place. But we want it to clot at the right time in the right place. And evolution can't answer that question. Darwin tried it, but I have read Origin of Species, and he makes a big emphasis on the finches of Galapagos Island and their beaks. But when all is said and done, they're still finches. Their beaks might be a little different based on the kind of seeds that they're eating, but they're still finches. Microevolution does exist. We see that with COVID as the virus mutates. That's microevolution. Macro, I don't think there's a case for it. And this whole issue of design, it all goes back. The first guy to come up with this idea was a man named William Paley, who gave the analogy of if you're walking through a field and you find a watch lying on the ground, what does the existence of that watch imply? It implies that there was a watchmaker, because here's this complex piece of equipment. It didn't just appear. There had to be some designer behind it. So the teleological argument also gives us a good, solid, reasonable reason for belief in a creator. Another aspect is what's called the anthropic principle. The universe seems to contain all of the necessary properties necessary to make the existence of intelligent life not only possible, but inevitable. We are the right distance from the sun. If we were any closer, we would burn up. If we were any farther away, we would freeze. The sun is the right color. If it was any bluer or any redder, it would interfere with photosynthesis of plant life, where the plants turn sunlight into energy. We're the right distance away from the moon, which allows for the action of the tides. The tides are what keeps the ocean from becoming stagnant. And so if there was any less gravitational effect of the moon, that stagnation would be destructive. It's going to destroy the life of the oceans. And if it was more gravitational pull, the tides would be excessive. The very mass of the moon stabilizes the rotation of the earth, the axis of rotation. We're tilted a little bit. That's why we have seasons. When we are in summertime, our part of the globe, the northern hemisphere, is tilted more towards the sun. And as wintertime comes along, well, because we're on our axis, we are tilted away from the sun. It gets colder. But because we have that tilt, which is affected by the gravitational pull of the moon, it stabilizes our axis. Otherwise, we'd be all over the place and our climate would not be survivable. The properties of water. Ice, when it freezes, it floats. It allows for the life to continue underneath the ice. It's the only element that floats when it freezes. The makeup of the atmosphere, we have the right levels of carbon dioxide and other gases to protect us from cosmic radiation. If we had too much, as you hear about global warming, we had the greenhouse effect. And even the reflectivity of the earth. We reflect enough of the sun's energy back to keep things right. If we reflected it all back, we'd freeze. If we didn't reflect some of it back, we'd have issues with that too. And the very fact, if you remember your little atoms, the protons that are in the nucleus are exactly 1,836 times larger than the electrons, which are the things that are orbiting around the nucleus, okay? If that wasn't the case, we would not exist, because the molecules that we are made up of would not exist. They'd be losing the electrons, whatever the case may be. Astronomers have identified 13 characteristics that are required for the existence of life on a planet. And there's a strong possibility they'll find more. They've also identified nearly 5,400 planets that are out there in the galaxy, orbiting other stars. Many of those planets have one of those characteristics. Some have two. But the only planet that has all 13 is the Earth. So a reasonable person would say that this was planned. Paul?
I have to hope that they'll find planets to be found that have the same conditions Earth does, and therefore have life. It's just a belief.
It's a belief.
The odds are so far. The anthropic principle is an excellent demonstration of God's design.
Absolutely. Well, what about the issue of Jesus? Was he a historical person? Does he pass the test? We have all kinds of information about Jesus here, but are there sources outside of Scripture? And there are. He's talked about outside of the New Testament. There's a Roman historian named Thallus who was writing in the early AD 50 time period. We do not have any of his works, but he was cited by another historian named Julius Africanus. And Thallus was trying to explain away the 3-hour period of darkness at the crucifixion of Christ, as saying, oh, it was just an eclipse. But Julius disagreed with that. And Tertullian, who was an early church father, writing about AD 100, keep in mind this is within 50 years of the church being established, he too said that the darkness at the time that Christ was crucified did occur. And it was not limited to Palestine. It was all over the Roman Empire. The Greek writer Phlegon, AD 137, he confirmed that episode of darkness as well. And Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, wrote about Nero, you remember our friend Nero, shifting the blame for the great fire from himself to the followers of Christus. He was calling them superstitious. And Tacitus also confirmed a lot of the details about Jesus Christ that are found in the New Testament. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman governor in Bithynia. He confirmed historical details of the New Testament as well. And then our old friend Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, not a believer, but he writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day." So there are lots of sources outside of the Bible that talk about Jesus Christ as a historical individual. Oops. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Are the scriptures reliable? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 40s, that took us back 800 years in the timeline of copies of the Old Testament books. And the accuracy between the ones from 800 years before to the next available copies was essentially 100%. There was no deviation in that 800-year period. And then we have what's called the bibliographic test. What about the New Testament? The bibliographic test looks at the number of copies that were written close in time to their sources, so that the original writers and the readers could easily critique the copies, okay? And how many copies are available? So here's an example. For the New Testament, for Caesar's Gallic Wars, it was written about 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy is from 900 AD, so that's about a 1,000-year gap. We have 10 copies of that, and yet we don't question the accuracy of that document. Same with Plato's Dialogues. Earliest copy was 900 AD. It's about 1,300 years. We have 7 copies, and nobody questions the accuracy of that. Tacitus, that Roman historian, earliest copy, 1100 AD, 1,000 years between the original and the copy. We have 20 copies of that. But look at the New Testament. The copies were being written as early as 40 AD, very soon after the events took place. And at a time when many of the people who were involved in those events were still alive and could verify the writing. So there was only about a 25-year time span. And we have over 24,000 either full manuscripts, copies of the manuscripts, or partials that can be compared. So the New Testament is extremely accurate from the originals. So the outer world, there's corroboration. The test of reason, it works. It's reasonable to believe that God is the creator, that he existed. We have that test of the outer world. There's that corroborating evidence, both for the existence of God and also the accuracy of Scripture, the historical accuracy of Jesus Christ. Well, what about the inner world? Another argument for the existence of God is what's called the moral argument, which sees the reality of our moral nature as evidence of a moral lawgiver. In other words, because we have a moral law within us, there must be a moral lawgiver who has given it to us. We all have this pervasive sense of right and wrong. It starts out at about 18 months, right? When one child takes the choo-choo away from the other, we have an issue. But by what are those standards being made? Why do we believe that we are subject to some kind of a moral standard for our behavior? Why do we expect others to play by the same rules? It's because we have this moral nature, which implies that there is a moral nature giver. So a biblical worldview believes that God has given mankind an obligation to meet certain behavioral standards that are a reflection of his character. And morality has a personal impact on us as well. And only a personality like God, a God who is personal, could have imposed such a morality. Because we are people with a moral bent. It took a person, capital P, to impart that to us. There are other inner world arguments, the religious experience argument. If there's a God, if there is no God, then how come billions of people have religious yearnings in their hearts? Could there be a connection? There's also what's called the argument from consciousness. How can a material object, if I'm just material, if I'm just stuff, how can that give rise to conscious thought, which is immaterial? And then there's also what's called the ontological argument, which says that the very idea of God, in other words, the fact that we can conceive of a God, is proof that there is a God. That one's kind of tough to wrap my head around, but the very idea that if we have that very idea that there is a God, then there must be. Paul.
The existence of consciousness is driving the humanists
Crazy?
crazy. They have no explanation. They can't deal with it.
Right.
So it's very much a stumbling block for them.
You know, that their argument would be, well, my thoughts are just electrical impulses that are taking place in my brain, in the organ. But no, there's obviously something more going on here. There's an immaterial side to us that results in that. Now, obviously, all of these arguments are not irrefutable proof that there is a God, but they do show that the belief in the existence of God is a reasonable belief. It's not a foolhardy leap of faith. It's a reasonable belief. So how about the last test of the real world? What are the consequences? If we apply this biblical theistic worldview, what are the consequences of it? Now, granted, Christianity has not always been perfect. They have the example of the Crusades. They have the example of the Spanish Inquisition. We have the example of, here in the United States, the Bible being used to justify slavery in the South. Obviously, those things are bad things. Christianity was used in the wrong way. But on balance, the outworking of the biblical theological worldview has been a positive for the world. Very significant and positive contributions to history. The abolition of slavery, William Wilberforce. The care of the poor and the needy. The entire concept of hospitals were Christian-based. Even the scientific method. We talked about how a biblical worldview is the basis for the scientific realm. That scientific method of going out there, coming up with a hypothesis, experimenting to see if that hypothesis works, and then going from there, that is a development from the biblical worldview. Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle and his gas laws, there's a whole slew of scientists who were working off of a biblical worldview in their experiments. Questions? Yes? As it currently exists, it's going to be destroyed. It was destroyed essentially in the past with the flood. Going forward, it's going to be destroyed by fire. But it will be made new again. And whatever that means, I'm not sure. You know, I got to be honest. I've always wanted to go to Scotland. You know, I'm thinking, if there's this new creation, will Scotland then be like Scotland is now? I don't know. I hope so, because I want to see what Scotland is like now. Rather than, I don't know, I'll accept it, whatever. because it'll be perfect. But there will be a new creation, new heavens and new earth. So as creation stands in its current state, it's not eternal. Paul.
An issue that seems to be a real difficulty for people who trying to reach with this message that, God created everything, is the short age involved in creation. If you, they say that's just totally unbelievable. They've been so indoctrinated that the earth and the universe has been here billions and billions of years. They can't conceive of it being only 6,000 or so.
Right.
But the issue is that I was going somewhere with it.
Are you a young earth creationist or an old earth creationist?
That's a difficult thing for them to understand.
It is.
Okay.
So, Brad, you had your hand up too. Right. Yep. If the copyist discovered an error, they threw it out and started over. And they would monitor how many words, how many lines, how many words in the line, and how many letters in the line, in the words in the line. So it was a very exacting process for them to copy. So we've kind of done a crash course in apologetics here. Go ahead.
I remember something I was trying to say.
Okay.
I just want to make the point that people who call themselves Christians and biblically based Christians believe there is a long age
Right.
in the universe.
Right.
And that's the problem is if you do that, you open the door to saying the Bible isn't historically accurate.
Right.
Then they can question other doctrines as well.
Exactly. That's the problem with not treating Genesis as history, is that when we start to do something different with it, and we start to throw that out, we can start to ask the question, what other things can we throw out too? So, for me personally, I'm a young earth creationist. I hold to a literal 6-day creation because that's a reasonable explanation. And I think we can show that even though we can't prove the existence of God, our faith is a reasonable faith. The biblical worldview passes that test of reason. It passes that test of the real world. There's corroborating evidence. It passes that test of the outer world, I should say. It passes the test of the inner world. Why do I have these religious leanings? Why do I seek God? And it passes the test of the real world. Brad. Oftentimes. Yep, oftentimes. Right. Exactly. David, I didn't quite get through everything I wanted to get through today. So, David is holding me accountable to my handout. So, I do want to pick it up. Leo. Oh, yeah. Yes. Question is, are the 24,000 copies of the New Testament complete? No. It's either fragments or complete letters, to one degree or another. So, Okay. We will pick it up at the tail end of David's handout next week because I do want to talk about, I got to tease him. He and I get along great. We really like each other. So that's right. I need him to keep me on task. So, but I would like to cover the last few points that we get on my handout next week, and so we'll jump into those. And then we will look at the first of our worldviews, well, the second now. Now that we have this biblical worldview in our back pocket, we're going to start to look at the others. So we'll start next week with, let me get you there, secularism or secular humanism. We'll talk about what is it, what are the characteristics, how do they view certain things like that. So be prepared.